Welcome to KR Films Entertainment Channel. Today I am going to explain a 2017 action-adventure film called Kong Skull Island. Goes wrong, the expedition team must find a way to Esther. They have no idea that their presence in the island poses a threat not only for themselves but also for its inhabitants, most especially to a giant ape known as Kong. The story begins in 1944. Two enemy soldiers, an American and a Japanese, crashed on what appeared to be a deserted island somewhere in the South Pacific. Despite just surviving their earlier ordeal, the two soldiers did not waste any time in attacking each other. The American fired all of his bullets against the Japanese but all missed its mark. In retaliation, the Japanese chased the American with a sword. After a brief game of cat and mouse, the American reached a cliff and had nowhere else to run. A short fight ensued at the precipice, almost ending in a victory for the Japanese. But when the Japanese were about to kill his enemy, a giant ape appeared out of nowhere. The two were stunned at what they saw. The movie then jumps to 1973 during the end of the Vietnam War. A gentleman, Bill Randa, wants to talk to a senator about an uncharted island in the South Pacific referred to as Skull Island. The senator dismisses the claim as untrue, but Bill insists that an expedition must be conducted. Bill's assistant Brooks manages to convince the senator by saying that if they do not make any move, the Russians might become the first to discover the island. The senator finally agrees to support them, but Bill asks for one more thing: a military escort. In the next scene, we come across Colonel Preston Packard, an army officer that seems to be adamant about ending the war. During a rainy night in Vietnam, Preston receives a phone call from his superior telling him that a group of scientists wants Preston and his squad to escort them on an uncharted island. Meanwhile, Bill and Brooks head to Saigon to find a man that can further help them in their expedition. The man in question is a former SAS officer by the name of James Conrad. Bill and Brooks, knowing that James is a capable man, accepts James' demands for a higher reward. Suspicious as to why the two scientists need a tracker like him, James asks them about the mission, but Bill and Brooks evade the question. The movie then cuts to a photographer named Mason Weaver. She receives a phone call about getting the job as the photographer for the expedition, causing her to become ecstatic. She then tells the person on the other line that she is only interested with the expedition due to its confidential nature. All key players assemble in a ship called the Athena, which is docked in Thailand. Afterward, a mission briefing is conducted for the upcoming expedition. They are told that the island is surrounded by storms, which is why it managed to elude human interaction for thousands of years. As such, they plan to drop seismic bombs to the surface of the island in order to map it out. The next day, the Athena sets sail towards the island. The ship then stops just outside the storms. A scientist tells them that it is dangerous to conduct a mission in this kind of weather, advising them that they should abort the plan. Bill, however, insists that they must continue. Despite the scientist's protest, the group moves forward with their plan. After the whole group's preparation, it is now time for them to head towards the uncharted island via helicopters. The helicopters fly towards the raging thunderstorm ahead of them. Despite the rocky ride, the helicopters manage to come through to the other side without casualties. There they see Skull Island in all of its untouched beauty. Just as planned, the helicopters drop seismic bombs throughout the island while other helicopters drop equipment for seismic analysis. Brooks informs Bill that the bedrock of the island is hollow. However, the bombing session is suddenly stopped when a helicopter gets hit by a flying coconut tree. Another helicopter is taken out by an angry giant ape who turns out to be Kong. In their collective confusion, the startled soldiers unleash a barrage of bullets against the imposing Kong. But they are no match against Kong's brute strength and size, easily dismantling the whole crew. Fueled by anger with what he had just witnessed, Preston wants to eliminate Kong. Meanwhile, James, Mason and others are separated from the rest of the expedition team. James figures that they have to get to the north end of the island as planned and find a way to somehow signal the ship. In this way, the ship will send a search party to rescue them from the island. In another part of the island, Preston contacts anyone who are still alive, managing to contact at least one of his soldiers named Chapman. He promises Chapman that he will come for him. After a while, Preston is also able to meet with some of his soldiers. Confirming the number of deceased soldiers from earlier, Preston immediately seeks Bill for answers. Without hesitation, Preston points a gun at Bill, interrogating him about the earlier encounter with Kong. Bill then spills the truth. Being the only survivor of a tragic monster attack 30 years ago, Bill made it his life mission to prove the existence of these ancient creatures. He then reassures Preston that if they go back with proof, they will surely send more soldiers to eliminate these monsters. Meanwhile, in another part of the island, Brooks explains to the rest of the survivors about his hollow earth theory. He tells them that this exact theory about underground spaces is the reason why Bill had taken Brooks under his wing. The group then encounters a giant buffalo-like creature that emerged from the waters. James tells the group to keep still and let the creature be. Fortunately, the creature does not bother them and returns to the water. The complete opposite happens to Preston's group. While walking in a field of bamboo trees, one of the soldiers dies when he gets impaled by a bamboo-like object which turns out to be a leg from a ginormous spider. the soldier immediately fires back against the creature. With quick thinking, the group cuts the legs of the spider, toppling it down like a tree. Back to James' group, they spot an abandoned ruin of some sort. Suddenly humans appear with spears pointed at James' group, with James trying to maintain peace between them, but the tension is suddenly broken when a bearded man comes out of nowhere. The man, dressed in an old aviator suit, introduces himself as Lieutenant Hank Marlowe, the American pilot from the beginning of the movie. In another part of the island, the lone Chapman washes his wounds in the river. Lo and behold, he sees the gigantic Kong walking towards his place. Chapman manages to hide before Kong is able to spot him. Suddenly, a large octopus attacks Kong from the waters below. By his brute strength, Kong easily defeats the monster and also gets himself a lunch as a reward. Back in James' group, Hank explains that they will be safe as long as they are within the human settlement of this island. Hank then communicates to the tribal people by just staring, and the people responds with a bow. Despite not responding verbally, Hank tells the group that the tribal people will let them stay. They then get inside a ship that had wandered in the island a long time ago. There they see the history of the island and its people. The tribal people known as Eevee used to live in fear of the monsters for 1,000 years, but for some strange reason one group of monsters started protecting them against the rest. This group of monsters belongs to Kong's species. However, their numbers have dwindled and Kong is the last of the Eevee's protectors. As such, they treat him as a god. Learning this, James asks if Kong killed Hank's Japanese friend. Hank answers no, attributing it instead to what he called skullcrawlers, a name he created because the Eevee people dare not to say these monsters' names. These same skullcrawlers wiped out Kong's family. James informs Hank that they have to get to the north end of the island within 3 days to be rescued because that is where the helicopters were supposed to refuel. Hank laughs this off by saying that it is an impossible task. However, he tells them that there is another way. The scene then jumps to Preston's group, who is currently crossing a green-colored river. After Preston shoots a pterodactyl, one of his soldiers quietly airs his doubt about the mission. He feels as if Preston has a personal vendetta against Kong that might hinder their survival. Back to James' group, Hank shows them the boat that he and his Japanese friend were supposed to use in escaping the island. The boat is made up of several plain parts and all it needs now is a few fixes to be operational. While the others get to work, Mason is taking a picture of the tribal people. She then stumbles outside the settlement through a crack on the wall and sees a similar buffalo-like creature stuck under a downed helicopter. She attempts to help the creature, but the helicopter suddenly gets lifted up by none other than Kong himself. Seeing her as non-threatening, Kong leaves immediately. Meanwhile, Preston's group spots a bloody handprint left by Kong. Preston reassures his group that they have enough munitions to take down the giant, but it might be too late for them to rescue Chapman because Chapman unfortunately gets killed by a skullcrawler without their knowledge. That night, under the colorful dark sky, the two separate groups tell a different story. While James' group is preparing to go to the north end of the island to be rescued, Preston's group is determined to save Chapman. The next day, after 3 tries to start the boat, James' group is now on their way to the north end of the island via the island's river system. Before leaving, Hank tearfully says goodbye to the Eevee people. While traveling down the river, they manage to contact Preston's group. After Preston's group shoots up a flare to determine their location, the scientists that are with James' group gets forcibly taken off the boat by pterodactyls and subsequently killed. The two groups finally meet again. Preston immediately tells James that they are not leaving yet because they have to rescue Chapman, but Hank warns them that Chapman's location is where the skullcrawlers live. James proposes that they will search for Chapman, but only for 24 hours. After that, they will return to the boat and then leave. The whole group marches forward to rescue Chapman. While en route to his location, they stumble upon a boneyard that Hank identifies as belonging to Kong's parents. Despite Hank's warning, the group proceeds. Inside the fumed area, the group encounters skullcrawlers. While the group hides from the skullcrawlers, one of the monsters vomits a skull that belongs to Chapman. Unfortunately, Bill, who is taking pictures, also gets devoured by a skullcrawler. The group is now cornered in the boneyard as the skullcrawlers make quick work of the soldiers. Fortunately, the group manages to fend them off. After the onslaught stopped, James reveals that Chapman is already dead. Despite this, Preston still wants to proceed to the crash site. Here, Preston's real intention comes to light. The crash site contains many weapons that are enough to kill Kong, whom he blames for their situation. The group is fractured by Preston's choice. James then tells Preston that he can proceed with his mission while the rest of the civilians will go back to the boat. After finding Chapman's letter for his son, Preston's group finally locates the crash site. That night, Preston's group gathers up all of the weapons and sets it up for Kong. Meanwhile, James and Mason climb up to a higher ground to find the river. At the top of the mountain, James and Mason encounter Kong, but instead of agitation, Mason calmly puts her hand on the giant. Kong spares the two but gets distracted by the explosion coming from Preston's area. Immediately, James and Mason arrive back to Hank and others, telling them that they will save Kong. Elated, Hank also wants to come with them. Meanwhile, Kong rampages towards Preston. When the giant is within distance, Preston throws his torch in the water, lighting it on fire. Kong goes down and Preston instructs his soldiers to place the bombs around the giant. But before they can finish the preparation, James Mason and Hank confront Preston's group, urging the soldiers to stop what they are about to do. Despite this, Preston defends his decision to kill Kong. After a thorough convincing, one of the soldiers who was with James' group earlier defies Preston's order by pointing his gun instead towards Preston. At this point, a much larger skullcrawler emerges from the waters. While the rest of the group runs to the forest, Preston stays, intending to finish what he started. Kong awakens and strikes Preston down without hesitation. However, the skullcrawler quickly overpowers Kong. As the group runs away, James instructs Mason to light a flare while the rest of them distract the skullcrawler. One of the soldiers decides to heroically sacrifice himself despite the protest of his comrades, but it is all for naught. The skullcrawler is still alive. Fortunately, Kong arrives just in time to attack the monster. A fierce battle ensues between the two giants. Meanwhile, Mason manages to fire the flare gun atop a mountain. When Kong was about to be eaten due to getting stuck on some chains, Brooks saves his life by firing at the skullcrawler. Just as the skullcrawler is about to reach the group's boat, Kong escapes his chain. Everyone now begins to attack the skullcrawler, with Kong bringing the most damage. However, amidst the battle, Mason gets knocked off of her spot and down to the waters. Kong saves Mason from drowning. The skullcrawler re-emerges to fight Kong. Despite having Mason on one hand, Kong manages to defeat his foe and the skullcrawler is no more. After safely dropping Mason on the ground, Kong looks back at them and silently leaves. The group then proceeds with their journey. James tells the group that news will definitely get out. The group then sees 3 helicopters out in the distance behind them. Kong emerges and screams at the uninvited guests of the island. The movie then ends. Thanks for watching.